We've had a really interesting conversation on this table here. I think that Jane's talk was really interesting, and I think it pointed for me to the professional development of teachers. So for me, formative assessment and how well it reflects connectivity or coherence is totally dependent on the professionalism and the professional knowledge of the teacher. So I'm going to ask you to, if you have a choice of what you talk to, can you talk about summative assessment rather than formative assessment? Because I think that's where the crux goes. So which tables have we used? Have we had that table there? No. Keith, would you like to start off, please?
We're a democratic table, so I'm passing to my colleagues to make contributions.
Okay.
You promised we might be able to say something about earlier sessions.
Yes, absolutely.
So David and Tabitha have something to contribute.
Excellent.
So, David Martin, Chair of the BICME of Committee of the JMC.
Which is sold out now, I understand.
Sorry?
Which is sold
just
out
about
now.
sold out, just those few, one or two places. So, I'll do the earlier part and then hand over to Tabitha to do that last assessment session. So we felt the framework was transparent, but as various decisions are made in building it, it can't be neutral. So to illustrate it, we looked at where do applications sit on the nodes, what aspects of money do we include, a choice about that, and do we form connections in the framework from a non-digital perspective? What makes a landmark? Who can edit the framework? And over to Tabitha.
Thank you. I think I've been thrown under the bus a little bit here with the last session. We talked actually quite a lot about formative assessment, so I will try and just talk more generally. But
Yes, fine.
we started by being asked by Keith, why do we assess? And when the response was, well, because the teacher needs to know where the students are, he said, well, why do they need to know where the students are? Why is it important that the teacher knows where the students are, in contrast to the students knowing where the students are? And if there was a means by which the students could do that by themselves, why is it important that the teacher knows? I don't have an answer to that. We didn't have an answer to that, but obviously we had a lot of conversations about that because that's quite provocative. And it's quite interesting to think if we could get to that point where a student had a tool and there was a suggestion that the framework might become such a tool for a student to assess their own learning effectively, why would a teacher need to know exactly where they were? So I'll leave that point there. And then we got onto the framework itself and the nature of landmark nodes, which have come up a couple of times. And we were talking about the fact that if the framework is going to contribute to assessment, the landmarks were the first place that perhaps people would go to. It's what's been said in the past when we've talked about these landmarks that were gateways, and it's interesting that we've changed from gateway to landmark. And actually that we're currently using a definition of landmark that is about bringing together pieces of mathematics. The landmark itself only exists if it's bringing together ideas from more than one theme, more than one strand, and that whole is more than the sum of the parts. And that's actually a very different picture to perhaps what we could have chosen as landmark places, and we're focusing on those connections rather than individual skills, which we'll have to see how it plays out. And again, I don't think we've got answers, but it was an interesting conversation about why and how teachers or students might assess their own learning. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, and thank you for sort of linking it back to the framework. I think that's really very helpful. Who would like to say, what other tables would like to say something? Because I think everybody's had a go now. Have we had a go on this table? Luke, you didn't say very much, did you, the first time? Would you like to have another go? Oh, Catch.
Okay, so we discussed Yeah, first of all, formative assessment I think is non-controversial, the importance of that and what Jane pointed to in her speech. So in terms of summative assessment, it seems that there are some disincentives for schools that are attempting to go into the curriculum in a lot of depth and go beyond the curriculum with accountability and end of key stage testing in mind. So there is maybe a shorter way for students to be successful in exams, and there's the way with teacher professionalism and integrity, which takes a lot more work. So I think as a teacher and as a school, schools having to really remain steadfast in amongst those forces against them, to be true to their values and what they're aiming to do in creating successful mathematicians, and that presents a challenge in the current framework.
Thank you. Joe, your table over here?
Yes, but I apologise and it's Lucy speaking.
Okay.
I told them I'd get in trouble if I talked too much, but they let me do it anyway. So we had a lovely discussion about, really, again, very similar to what Tabitha said, the nature of assessment, the role of assessment, and really looking at the idea that we place so many things, we pile so many things of value on these very poor proxies of mathematical understanding, and where that might lead to, and actually how we could try and dissemble that in some way. What would it even look like? And we had a discussion about problem solving and reasoning and whether they really are examined in any way under the current system. Probably not, was the conclusion. And then we thought about the question, again, very similar, who has the most understanding about a student's own mathematical understanding currently, and who should, and how might that affect the system as a whole?
It's a very interesting word, understanding, isn't it? How can you ever tell whether somebody can understand something? I don't think you can. You can only say what they can do. And I think that's quite a moot point. So if you have something that says you need to understand something as a target, how do you prove that? You can only show what somebody can actually do. Okay, what about the table at the back? Rod?
All right, so we talked about sort of balance and what hybrid systems can look like, where, if it seems like a lot of the power is with summative assessment in one system, there might be other systems around the world that would be good reference points for a different role. So not that summative assessment doesn't have a valuable role once you can work out what it is, whether it's for looking at where students are and giving teachers a picture of that, or for accountability. But for example, we talked about the Netherlands, where a national assessment contributes to maybe about 15%. Did you say 50? Oh yeah, okay. So it contributes to half of what the student needs to complete their schoolwork. And then the schools also have marks. So that has the effect of giving the schools a little bit of a way to incorporate other kinds of assessment in students' day-to-day activities that aren't necessarily dictated by the national system, even though it still exists.
And so is that 50%, is that the place where you'd see the connectedness and the coherence then? Is that what you're saying?
Could be. It could be.
If it wasn't in the traditional summative sense, if you have a mixed bag, you've got an opportunity to support the connectedness and coherence in the other 50%.
Which still depends heavily on teacher content knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge.
Okay.
And so.
Thank you. Rob?
Is it all down to me? Okay. What bits were coming out? You can all correct me. We were just looking at, isn't it interesting how so many other countries do it so differently, and what one can learn from that. This kind of reflects what they were saying. And who is assessment for cynically, is actually most assessment being done for the convenience of the people who set tests and recruit, and very little of it is done for the benefit of the kids who are being assessed. Yeah?
Rob, do you think in your maths inspiration workshops that one of the benefits of them is the connectedness and coherence of mathematics? I mean, because it exemplifies it, doesn't it?
It's not a deliberate thing.
No, but it does.
But it's,
because it's real maths.
How do you engage people? It's when they can connect what they're doing to their experience, to the world they know, and they discover connections between, oh, this is about triangles and that relates to that. It sort of just emerges from when it's a natural process of seeing a situation, seeing how it's connected to math. So we do not have any policy that says we will connect all these things. There is a little tick box saying it would be good to get at least one reference to something that's in Gcse into this talk. So, but that's as far as it goes. But I think, yeah, probably.
Okay, thank you.
We also talked about some of the constraints around writing GCSE exam papers, markers, competition between boards, 1 2 mark questions versus 4 and 5. The requirement to be able to mark very accurately and the constraints that puts on. So we did spend quite a lot of time on the sort of the system that we've got. And those of us with longer memories were remembering back to days of Gcse when there were scrutineers who used to scrutinise the process in awarding bodies, right from the design of questions and construction of papers and training of markers and all that sort of thing, which doesn't happen now. It happens after the event now, I believe. So it's...
Why don't you give the box to Neil? Neil can tell you what happens. Can't you, Neil?
Neil Ogden, OCR. Yes, whenever question papers are sat, sort of following the awarding, we'll sort of go into a review process looking at how well the students have responded, taking that towards future assessments, yes.
And the 1 and 2 mark questions, there's something about 1 and 2 mark questions only being able to assess something which is absolutely tiny, aren't they? Whereas if you've got much longer questions, then you've got much more of a chance of being able to exemplify the reasoning and the problem solving.
Some disparity between boards as to the frequency of those.
Yeah.
My understanding is that.
Yeah, but we know which one's best. Okay. Anything more from that table over there, Michael? Anything more from your table?
I think professional development dominated quite a lot of the discussion here. General consensus that assessment, when done well, skilled practitioner, good subject knowledge, strong pedagogy, can be very rich. We talked about a wider dimension of assessment than maybe a sort of daily test, and then probably reflected more on the gap that exists at the moment, and less consensus on how we fill that particular gap. Some ideas around the table, but that was a real challenge.
Thank you. Derek?
Thank you. Really, a lot of the points have already been made. I suppose the answer to the question is how does assessment detract or contribute? It depends on the assessment, and we certainly thought that the kind of in this country at the moment, the sort of high stakes, low trust assessment model that we've got for summative assessment probably detracts a lot more than it contributes. However, we do meet in the shadow of the Secretary of State's announcement that nothing is going to change for the foreseeable future. So it looks like we're stuck with it. I mean, you could probably argue, we didn't get onto this, that other models for even summative assessment, like PISA, for example, probably do more to promote coherence and connectedness of the maths curriculum. But for now on, it's not a very cheering picture of the assessment model that we're living in.
Okay. Yes, Tony.
Can I be even more reactionary and speak up on behalf of summative assessment? I think it is liberating, as long as one doesn't take it too seriously. And we should look back at the history of where centralized testing came from and what it saved us from, and spend a little time thinking what the alternative is. Of course, if everyone was perfect, we could just trust every teacher to give a correct grade to every student. But we don't have that situation, and as long as teachers don't take the summative assessment as their goal, and so we should focus on how to avoid getting trapped into that and make the assessment as good as we can, and recognize that that is not really what the educational process is about, but it's a liberating way of getting a final number. So I never thought I would get quite so reactionary, but I believe it very strongly. Also, I don't know about school level, but at university level, I always found that the 1 and 2 mark questions were there to try and help the weaker students, but they didn't. The students got far more marks on scraping sort of 3s on a 4 or 5 mark question than they did on the 1 2 mark question. Basically, they couldn't get something right. So on the 1 2 mark questions, they scored very, very poorly. I have no idea whether that happens at school level.
Thank you. Hugh.
Two things. First of all, the absence of long chains of reasoning in the summative assessment is, I think, the crucial gap. It will lead to less inter-marker reliability. There'll be more inter-marker variation, which is accepted in most other subjects.
Yes.
We are obsessed with the fact you get a 1 or 2% variation between markers. That's a huge weakness in what we do. But if we do have extended reasoning questions of the kind you referred to, it has to be recognized that if the difficulty has many dimensions, and if it's a more complex, less familiar task in which students are expected to be autonomous for a longer time, then it must be technically easier. And there exists plenty of such tasks, but they tend to be dismissed. Oh, you know, it's not proper maths. What they mean is it's not maths that we taught them in the last couple of years, which they haven't really understood well enough to solve non-routine problems with. So I would make a plea for the gradual introduction of a mathematical essay task in which mathematical reasoning is tested in a situation that has meaning to the students and which can be then gradually become the part of the assessment that it is of the intended curriculum. And then it will become part of the enacted curriculum.
Thank you. Celia, did you want to say something?
Actually, what we wondered on this table was whether we should get rid of all final summative assessments, all these things, Key Stage 2 tests and Gcse. And actually, what I would really like is some data. I want to know how much it costs to do all this testing. I mean, money that the schools are paying. I don't know, but I'd quite like to know that. I also would like to know how much time is lost. Yep. Kids just practicing. It's all very well, Tony, saying, tell teachers it's not important. It is important for their lives and for their future. You know, management are asking them all the time. How much time is lost? So I'd really like to have this data. And then we'll say, we actually got rid of all that money wasted on this and the competition between the awarding bodies, and indeed keep doing it, and all the time kids are doing just practicing. What could we do instead? And that's what we dreamt about a bit. Now, I realise that not everybody's a teacher like Craig here, but I mean, we could try and make more Craigs. I really do think so. It might be possible in terms of people who really have thought about the mathematics, who can help teach it. It's so much, it gives us so much more hope than just this. I mean, we're doing a project in primary school where they stop teaching in January. A lot of the primary schools in order to practice for these blooming tests. And they've only just started learning. And then they're just practicing, they're doing it all written, algorithms. I mean, it's so boring apart from anything else. And it's such a waste of time. And a lot of them can't do it at the end. So, I mean, you've lost a load of mathematicians. So I actually think that's what we should try and work towards. But I would like this data, and I don't know who's going to get it. Maybe you could, maybe. I want to know the costs of all our system.
I'm sure we could do a Freedom of Information Act, couldn't we?
Yeah, but you've got to do a bit of research as well, haven't you? It's not just... Anyway.
I think the thing about the primary schools is that not only do they practice from January till whenever they are, but then when the SATs come, the children don't want to do any more maths, so they do art and music and PE then. So, yeah. We're going to stop there.